Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today to introduce our SGS webinar, IT and Telecom Suppliers Boost Your CDP Climate Score. My name is Kim LaFrancois, and I'm the ESG Business Development Manager for North America here at SGS. I've been in the testing, inspection, and certification industry for 10 years, working with many different clients throughout various industries. The other speaker joining me today is Adam Hammis. Adam is the ESG Director at SGS and has 20 years of experience as corporate ESG sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. Adam has founded multiple organizations and has an MBA with international education and leadership experience, integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategy. He has also taken many different courses to become a competent and effective resource for ESG and sustainability. We're in great hands today with Adam. Today's webinar will cover a short overview of SGS, 5 North American drivers for the IT and telecom industries, CDP Impacts and supply chain members, CDP Scoring and Customer Use, how to improve CDP Climate scores, SGS resources, and Q&A. Please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. We will also be sending out an email with a link to the on-demand version of this presentation, along with a copy of the slide deck later today. You can also find the presentation on our YouTube channel within about 2 weeks. I'll now pass it over to Adam so we can dive right in.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thanks for everyone for being on. I won't spend a ton of time introducing you to SGS. You probably know who we are, but we are the world's leading testing, inspection, and certification company. We've been around for a very long time, and we have boots on the ground around the world. We are not new to sustainability. It is embedded in the company from the top to the bottom in our core values. And we've got 25 plus years of experience. We've sat on the working groups, creating a lot of the standards and been the first to certify and verify many of them, as well as we're recognized and rated by most of the agencies that our clients are as well. And so we score very highly and we take that very seriously, trying to raise the bar on industry leadership, but makes us also very knowledgeable on how those ratings work, which is relevant for today. No matter what we jump into, it's always important that, CDP, which we'll get into, is sort of an existing off-the-shelf solution. It's a platform, but it's always important to know where you are and to make it fit into your overall strategy. So just in general, has your organization published an annual ESG or sustainability report? That is a really good milestone to think of. It just means you've gone through at least one series or 1 year of data and try to go through the headaches that come with that. I will say yes to us. SGS has been a leader, and we've been publishing an integrated report for the last few years. We were the first in our industry, and that's just something that we are very proud of. But I'll give you a few more seconds to put your own answers in. But just as an aside, integrated reporting is when you report your non-financials, your ESG or your sustainability information, whatever you want to say, your material topics, environmentally and socially, alongside your financials. So it is a movement to have more material topics, less information, but more relevant information, and to have it assured at the level of your other information. So 100% say yes, so we're in good hands today. The 5 drivers right now for sustainability overall, really greenhouse gas regulation, and this has changed in just the last couple of years. In North America, greenhouse gas is front and center. So I'll talk about just Canada and the US, IFRS, or some people say ISSB. S2 specifically, released last year in June, is the climate disclosure standard. It's actually being translated or interpreted into the CSDS, which is under comment right now, but the Canadian version of that will be out this fall. And the US does not fall under IFRS for everyone who's following that. We're still a GAAP accounting country, one of the holdouts. But Canada does have, like the US, an heavy industry mandatory reporting program, also a federal supplier rule. Doesn't impact that many suppliers because it has a very high threshold. And what's called the B15 rules are for federally regulated financial institutions. In Canada, that's going to have a very dramatic impact because it's banks and insurance institutions that their clients are going to have to start reporting up to them because financed emissions is the topic of those rules. The USA mirrors that, except we have the California SB 253 and 261 for companies 500 million and 1 billion in revenues. There's some thresholds for that, reporting climate risks and disclosures if you do business in California. The proposed SEC climate rule. Then we have also a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program for heavy industries, a proposed federal supplier rule that's not in effect yet, but it covers far more companies than the Canadian federal supplier rule. And then FDIC guidance to our large banks, not nearly as many, but still a huge impact as those banks have been asked to look at their risk in their financed emissions. Now, sustainability and ESG regulations, that is broader, really not local here, but globally, the IFRS S1 is going to impact Canada when CSDS goes through, and that's the general sustainability disclosures. And then very big, coming out of the European Union is CSRD. So companies, I think there's about 3,000 US and Canadian companies that are impacted by the CSRD regulations that they're doing business in the European Union. And those are for broader environmental, social, and governance KPIs and materiality. So regulations are catching up, but we're about 3 to 5 years behind Europe, South America, and East Asia. Or if you're a big multinational with a supply chain, you're already being impacted by those. So regulation is number one. Then you have your public sustainability ratings. Those have been around longer, but investors and creditors are using those for buy, sell, lend decisions. So they have been impacting companies, and they've been looking at those closely. If you are scored by DJSI, MSCI, ISS, and Sustainalytics. But then what's really kind of ramping up, which we'll talk about today, are customer requirements in the supply chain. So these large brands that probably have an ESG score for investors are now looking at how do we manage our supply chain data, and they're increasingly requesting supplier data in the 100 companies at a time or 1,000 companies at a time. CDP being specifically about greenhouse gas emissions from their climate survey. They do have a forestry and a water survey. I believe biodiversity is coming, but by and far, climate is definitely used more than the other surveys. What's interesting is they have the supply chain members, which are publicly disclosed companies who said we are going to use CDP and request that all of our supply chain report their greenhouse gas emissions into the CDP platform so that we can manage our supply chain and get aggregate data that's really useful for best practices. The IT and telecom sector specifically has 50 companies represented under that and is the largest group represented under the CDP supply chain membership. EcoVadis is a broad ESG and sustainability reporting platform, but it has 100,000 reporters and growing. Again, they have something similar, but they have sector initiative brands. They have over 1,100 different brands under that header of sector initiatives that are represented. And the IT and telecom sector has 53 different brands represented, companies, which is the second largest category. So we'll be talking about that today, and that's really get into the nitty gritty. Because we're going to do CDP, we actually have another webinar on deep diving into the EcoVadis ICT sector initiative. But I'll just tell you, it's a 45-member alliance with the buy-in procurement alliance with 7 other major brands, which are listed here, with the mission to drive improvement in the information and communications technology ICT supply chain. Again, we go into that in detail, but a very big push into the supply chain for broad ESG data and disclosure. We have a workshop on that. I won't belabor the point, but the next one's coming up quarterly. We have a September 13th. We have a 4-hour technical workshop that we think very highly of, and we're very good at it because we have to do EcoVadis ourselves. And we bounce back and forth between platinum and gold as the methodology changes, but we're always up to date on the platform. And then if you look at the next driver, consumers are willing to pay more for health and sustainability. The LOHAS, which is lifestyles of health and sustainability consumers, globally it's a $546 billion market and growing. In the USA, for instance, it's 23%, but it grows about 10% per year. And then a recent McKinsey survey showed that 70% of consumers are willing to pay more for green products. They call it price parity if they perform well, or quality parity of function and quality. And 50% of companies, which is coming to this sector, are saying business growth is driving their sustainability initiative. So actually entering and capitalizing on new markets with sustainability linked products and services. And then last but not least is employees and winning the talent wars for skilled labor. And depending on categories, it's no off-the-shelf solution. But IBM's 2022 Institute for Business Value survey, where they interviewed 16,000 employees in 10 different countries, showed that just over 2/3 more willing to apply for and accept positions with sustainable companies. A similar Unily survey just in the UK of 2,000 office workers said 83% of those thought their employer was not doing enough, and 65% would prefer to work for a better company, quote unquote, on sustainability. And so all those things are the drivers. It's not one thing impacts each company equally, but those are the 5 key drivers to consider. You'll probably have your own unique combination of those, which we'll ask here. It's always good to know the combination, but what's your number one driver? So what would you prioritize and what are you trying to do first? And that's going to drive your strategy. And then you can mix in what's number 2, number 3. I would say that for us as SGS, we have, I'll say public sustainability ratings. Really, it's everything. We serve our clients. We have public ratings because we're a giant global publicly traded company. But we also believe in it and our values, and we offer these as services. So what is yours? Is it regulatory pressure, public sustainability ratings, supply chain customers asking and making requests? Is it consumer pressure, trying to make consumers happy with sustainability products and services, or are you employees? If you have an other, I love it. And these can't be the only ones, but just put it in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear what your other is. So feel free to suggest. I'll give everyone a few more moments to look into this, but the same theme is, just because we give you some examples, whatever matters to your organization, or if you're a consultant, consider whatever matters to your clients is what's their company, what's material to them, and you have to know your priorities. What's first, what's second, what's third. Never adopt an off-the-shelf plan or ESG strategy just because somebody else is doing it or somebody asks you to. You should always fold it into a strategy that adds business value to your company. So give everybody a few more seconds. And we've got a nice split between ratings and supply chain customers, which makes sense of why you're here today. So CDP Impacts and supply chain members. Let's get into the meat of this. CDP really it's the youngest and it's the largest GHG rating agency. If you look at the rating agencies that are most commonly known, they are mostly ESG and sustainability. They're broad and they collect a lot of different categories and you integrate ESG, different categories. But CDP, I put it in line with all these others, which are very globally popular, and just seeing how many rated agencies are using it. They're already surpassed MSCI, Sustainalytics, ISS, DJSI. It was previously called the Carbon Disclosure Project, but as you know, they have more surveys, but it's very young. The only one outpacing CDP on climate disclosures is even younger, EcoVadis, but that's because it has a much broader reach for ESG. But CDP is growing rapidly and at an increasing rate. Something fun to mention is that not the SEC supplier rule, but the US White House federal supplier rule that was proposed and is still under review was the first regulatory scheme that I've seen that actually names CDP specifically and says, we require you to report to meet this regulatory rule using CDP. And so I think that's going to become even more common as different tools become basically globally accepted and their methodology is aligned with all the different standards. So CDP is growing and important. And if you look at supply chain members, as I said, in this industry, IT and telecom, these are the publicly available names, the companies who have signed up and said, we are now a supply chain member, and we are going to ask that our suppliers report their greenhouse gas emissions within this tool, CDP. So that's causing the rapid hockey stick growth because, like I said, 100, 1,000 companies at a time are now jumping on and disclosing for the first time often. And these companies are not large publicly traded companies. These are small, medium-sized enterprises, often privately held. And that's new. It's a whole new wave of companies that are getting into the greenhouse gas disclosure game. And so it's going to be a big shift. It's already a big shift. Now, if you want to look at the future impacts of how that is going to continue, you can sort of look at this, and you can, above the orange dotted line are the investor-driven standards and sort of the alignment that's been happening. And that's like pure ESG or just financial materiality to the bottom line of the company. Everything below is more of the quote unquote sustainability or impact materiality. Some people call it double materiality. But GRI and UN SDGs are clearly like good for the planet, good for society, a lot of feel good brand building that are not purely financial materiality, but integrated reporting, SASB, TCFD, a few years ago became the Values Reporting Foundation, absorbed recently last year into the IFRS, which is the majority of the world follows that guidance, including Canada. And they've spit out last year the S1 and S2 standards, where the S2 is specifically the climate-related disclosure standard. And those are effective as of the 1st of this year. And like I said, Canada is interpreting that into the CSDS, and every local jurisdiction is interpreting their own version of IFRS, or some people call it ISSB, S1 and S2 standards. But the S2 standard is going to get tons and tons of attention, as well as CDP is going to grow and continue to grow as a platform for probably the largest amount of users and reporting organizations. So just to consider that those two things fit really well together, and CDP is aligned. Their new release of their platform is aligned with the IFRS or ISSB S2 standard. That's a lot of information. Has your organization received a CDP Climate survey request from a customer? So it could be yes, could be no, not CDP Climate, but some other similar request, or no, not yet, because it is possible. We have, not only do we have them, we got multiple, so I'll say yes, but we give multiple. So we request to our suppliers as well. And so we're a yes on both sides. But just wondering, like for you, if you haven't received one, then the idea of being on here and learning, you might try to preempt some possible requests from CDP, or maybe you're a federal supplier. It's really kind of could be anything. But if you do have one, there's a great reason to get to know it more. If you haven't received one, but you're receiving other climate survey requests from large customers, you probably are going to see more of those. I'd be shocked if you don't, or you might be someone sending them. So either way, but I'll give everyone a few more moments to put their answers in. 100% not CDP Climate, but similar. Okay, so maybe folks are just here preemptively looking at what they can do. And if you're here because you have suppliers you want to use this, I'll let you know that this is recorded like all of our webinars, and you can find and send our YouTube recording of this on SGS North America. Our YouTube channel is SGS North America, so you'll get this recording soon, and you can send it out to your suppliers if you want them to get to know about it. So how do you do the CDP scoring? What's the methodology, and how are customers or brands using it? And so let's take a deep dive. And again, we have a deeper dive, which is a 4-hour technical workshop, but this is still really good. We're going to cover as much as we can. Do you get a score from CDP after you've disclosed? And this is ours, so we're just showing you ours. So we have an A-. We bounce between a leader list on A and A-. But you also get this specialized professional services. That's our peer group. You get a Europe, so we're a Swiss company, so you'll see your region, and you also have a global average. So there's some multiple comparisons here to see how you stack up, but you always get a letter grade. That's what it is. It's a report card. If you're in the US, that's what we get, and we're used to. All these different agencies take completely different approaches. But the CDP questionnaire for climate is a report card letter grade. You do get an industry grouping, so it is trying to be apples to apples. It's not perfect, but they don't compare you. The questions you get and the scores you get are relative to your peer group. You can see here, SGS is in Europe, Switzerland. We're a general questionnaire, and we have specialized professional services. So scoring and comparison will both be more relevant than just looking at everybody as if they're the same company. And then some other beneficial things are to see where you stack up. So within your peer group, they tell you a pie chart of Disclosure, which we'll go over next, is the lowest. Then there's awareness, then there's management, and there's leadership. So we're in leadership with 17%. So we're in the top 17%. That's really helpful to know. And then also here is a sample of A-list companies. So if we wanted to look and say who are the best of the best in our industry group, we know where to look and who to benchmark against. So these are helpful tools. And now let's look at just the methodology. So the purpose stated is by CDP Climate is to measure where an organization is on the road to operating in line with a future that limits global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's in direct alignment with the Paris treaties and all of the targets that people say is 50% reduction by 2030, climate neutral by 2050. That's where that comes from. But also CDP Climate fully aligns with, first, it was the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, that reporting framework, and other major standards for comparable data. I would say now IFRS S2 is taking the reins and going even a little further than TCFD. But they're really looking for level of detail, comprehensiveness of response, your awareness of issues, your management methods, and then progress and performance. So if you look over here, I'll break all these down, but it is the letter grade, and there's a clear percentage breakdown of how you get an A versus an A minus. So let's walk through these really quick. There is an F. A lot of people don't talk about it, but it's simply failure to report. You got requested by someone, you didn't do it, you failed. That's it. And sometimes it's a failure to provide sufficient info. If you got on and you really kind of didn't try very hard and you submitted some things, but it wasn't sufficient, you can still get an F, which is failure to report. I recommend not doing that. But really it starts, most people talk about a D, which is simply you answered every question. They were roughly a point each. Even if you said, nope, we don't do it or not applicable, you answered everything. But a D versus a D minus is you have some extensive information disclosed, more levels of detail, a few more comprehensive responses, but literally it just says that you disclosed. That's why it's called a disclosure level, and it's something better than an F, and you're starting to disclose, and you've signaled that you're participating to whoever requested that you do it. Then you want to move into C, that's awareness. There is a minimum disclosure score. There's basically a prerequisite, if you will. You have to hit the minimums to be able to kind of be even allowed to get an awareness score. So they will tell you on the platform, but it's really about a comprehensiveness of your evaluation of the climate change kind of intersections and impacts. Often this is where the risk assessment, but you have to have a knowledge of climate change itself. And so the difference between a C and a C minus is the higher levels of awareness, which you get into senior governance body for accountability of climate risk. So there's some governance. You might want to, I kind of wish they called the C scoring ring the governance category. But you've got some senior governance body, you've got a risk assessment aligned with TCFD and now IFRS S2. And then you have started to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory or carbon footprint that includes scope 1 and 2 at a minimum, but then scope 3, you get more points. So that's where awareness comes in. Then you get into actual management. I kind of wish they were calling this just actions or practices, but this is where you've identified risk, you've moved on to managing it. So again, you have a minimum awareness score from the previous that you've done some of those things. You can't move up if you haven't hit some of those prerequisites. But then this is all about the comprehensiveness of how you're managing those climate change impacts and essentially starting to identify reductions and things like that. How you get a B over a B minus requires good management and addressing climate impacts with clear action. So things that you would have to have for a B are verified, a third-party assurance, verified GHG emissions inventory to ISO 14064-1, a certified environmental management system, ISO 14001 or ISO 50001 are very common, documented GHG emissions reductions, and documented renewable energy sourcing. For a B, that's the management category. And then you can move into A and or the A list, A minus and A list, which is you have a minimum management score, again, prerequisites from the previous. And then it's the comprehensiveness of your company's implementation of current best practices in managing climate change. So that's full disclosure in accordance with TCFD. So basically a snippet is TCFD. There's a lot of boilerplate, I would say very non-robust tools that just churn out boilerplate language that some people do as a bare minimum, and that is technically allowed, but it is not in full accordance with TCFD. TCFD has 4 pillars, and they're very specific, and a lot of times people leave things out. So to be in the A list, you have to disclose fully in accordance with TCFD. You have to set science-based targets, the SBTs, in alignment with the Paris treaties. That's the 50% reduction by 2030, climate neutral by 2050, and create a climate transition plan. How you get to A list over an A minus requires best practice in both strategy, action, and performance. So you must verify scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions with a third-party assurance provider, and 70% of your total emissions with a CDP approved standard. There's a list of those on the website. You must have robust governance and oversight, which is proof of actions and meetings, and you can't just show that you have a committee. You have to show their actions and their involvement. You must have rigorous risk management processes, and you must be reducing emissions across the entire value chain, which means into scope 3, not just in scope 1 and 2, and that's how you get to the A list. So in the scoring methodology itself, it gives you a really clear path of what you might be missing and in what order you might want to develop a program, but we'll go into even more detail here next. But a lot of people want to know, how do customers use this information, especially if you're a supplier and you're being asked for it for the first time. There is no universal way, but this is the broad approach, and I'll explain why, but it's basically risk management for brands themselves, because risks are inherent, but you have to balance risks with commercial needs of your company. And so what you'll see is the preferred vendor status is what is kind of manipulated or adjusted based on the scoring that comes out of CDP. So if a giant company wants their suppliers, they first make a request and they say, please disclose, or maybe we require you to disclose, but usually it's a request. And so first they're just looking for disclosure so they can have transparency, period, into the supply chain, so they can identify potential risks. It doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen, but they're not looking to weed out any suppliers because they need them. And that's how you run your business. And then usually you'll start with an incentive program, because incentives, again, do not limit your ability to work with suppliers, but you start to reward good behavior and say anyone above, this score perhaps gets a preferred vendor status, and that might come with larger contracts, discounted, pricing, or not discounted for you, like a higher price, a premium price. Or there are lots of different incentives you can do to say anyone above this score gets this. I don't see a lot of multiple thresholds, but you can, but occasionally that will happen. But that incentivizes positive movement and last. And usually, this could be a 5 to 7 year period. That's usually not the immediate thing that people do, but they do see in mature programs where they've got disclosure, they've got incentives in place for positive performance, they can start to put a floor and say, if you can't get above this score, F and D, it might be in C, that we're going to not work with you. And maybe you're on a performance plan, and in the next year, if you can't get up, but that usually comes last. So it gives people a runway to improve. But that is the general evolution of a program, using that preferred vendor status as a tool, but it's more of a partnership to say, if you disclose, then we can start working with you, and then we could possibly give you incentives and last penalties, or however you want to describe it. But that is typically how those evolve. So what is your organization's current CDP climate score? I already told you ours is an A list. But if you don't have a score yet, just do it A, F, D. These are, I would just say, there's no judgment here, because even if you get an F and it's your first year and you just didn't have the ability to, it just means that's where you are in the process. And a D is better than an F the next year. A C is better than a D the next year. It's not about going from not disclosing to an A. It's about showing improvement, and it's more about, what do your stakeholders want? If there is no threshold and they just want you to be at disclosure, a D and a D minus is a great score, because it meets the goals of your program. So that's just what I want to throw out there, is that don't take this as a value judgment. It's really about setting a program and a target score that works for your organization and your stakeholders. I'll give everyone a few more moments to put in here, but hopefully that scoring made sense. I will repeat that if you had any questions on the scoring methodology, throw them in the Q&A box and I'll be happy to answer them. In a few more seconds. We got a nice, okay, so we got some in the Bs and some scores yet. But B is a very good score, so congratulations to everyone who has that. So how else do you improve your CDP climate score? Because clearly you can go through the steps, and I described some very clear ways to move through, but what are some, I would say, like tricks and tips to boost your score even more? So let's look at it. The CDP Climate, 1 band per year, and that might be too aggressive for you if you just want to move from a C- to a C, but you would just want to do 1 incremental improvement. Do not get confused about the scoring and realize that the scores, what they reflect is governance, management systems, and then last is performance. And those are things that do not get implemented overnight. They cannot necessarily be implemented simultaneously. Governance typically comes first, management systems come next, policies and procedures, and last, performance follows. So it is a natural evolution, and rushing it is not good for creating a long-term sustainable program that will lead to performance. And so rushing and taking on too much at once is not preferable to taking a slow and steady approach, which, slow and steady wins the race. So I would just strongly recommend that you set yourself reasonable goals and set leadership reasonable expectations, that's how your program can and should evolve and mature over time. But then let's look at some other options just to give you an insight. This is how the climate journey works. This is what we use with all of our clients, but there's an awareness stage, setting priority stage, a strategy stage, those go in order, and then you execute. So you have to have all those things before you execute, and then you have to execute before you can report. And that's the cycle. You typically create your climate strategy. It might take 2, sometimes 3 years to really get your hands around it. But then once you put out an annual report, you typically are on an annual cycle. And then you'll just revisit the awareness, priorities, and strategy stage before you execute again through the year, and then report and wrap things up at the end. And it really is the governance structure. That's why they're all color-coded. It happens in order, but internal leadership and governance happens with stages 1, 2, 3. And that sequence mitigates risk. You look at all those 3 things before you execute. And they're also usually conducted by what's called it's a different level of role-based leadership, which is a senior ESG committee or a senior sustainability working group or whatever you want to call it. But it's a senior level of governance body that is accountable for climate risk management and strategy. Its board members often have board oversight. It should. C-suite, VPs, directors, if you have a dedicated ESG professional, lead counsel, because there's a lot of legal issues with reporting. And then there are other, which we'll talk about next. But this is the steps that you should go through from a company approach. And if you don't have a governance body, you should think about why. And this is why those things in the CDP bands, which they're called scoring bands, that's why they evolve in this way. And then I'll just say we have really great training. We tailor our training specifically to the individuals. So you can see here that we have kind of an intro course that's on demand, but we have a strategy course, an execution course, and a reporting course, because there's a lot of different roles within your company that need to work on this, and they don't have the same skill sets needed. Here's an example from the ICT sector. So here's Verizon. This is publicly available information. I'm not going to dive into it too much, but you'll find this in any really good reporting, is that there's a governance, and they disclose exactly what their governance is. They have a prioritization assessment, which I mentioned is the second step. They show exactly how they use different tools to prioritize. And then here you can see climate change is one of their top high priority issues, which is their list in their strategy of their material topics. And every good company that's going to do reporting on ESG and sustainability has that governance piece that does basically a materiality assessment with stakeholder engagement and comes up with a strategy which includes material topics. So that's why a governance body is so critical. Even for small companies, you have to have some governance in place, or don't expect your program to improve that well over time or at all. And then here's how you equip that group with information to actually improve your score faster. So you should know that CDP Climate Questionnaire specifically, every question is categorized, and those categories are also broken down in your score. So you can see, this is terrible color coding, so I apologize, especially if you're colorblind, but value chain engagement, targets, scope 3 emissions, scope 1 and 2 emissions, risk management processes, risk disclosure, opportunity disclosure, governance, energy, emissions reduction initiatives, business strategy, financial planning, and scenario analysis. So all of that, those are categories. Your score, so this is SGS's, our top bar, which is only slightly darker than, I hope this changes when the new reports come out this year. But they're slightly darker purple or fuchsia is a C, and then the activity group is the dark purple, and then the slightly lighter purple is ours. So we're exactly the same as our industry group average here, but on targets we're ahead. We're a B, while our average industry group is a C. So you can look through each of these and say, oh, well, we're already ahead here, probably don't need to work on it if competitive advantage is your issue. We're doing well. I'm showing you something that we've done. But if we were a D and our average of the community of our industry group was a B, that's a great opportunity. We don't want to be a laggard, so we want to catch up. And so that's how you could easily identify some priorities of where you want to improve your score and where you're actually going to get the most leverage in improving your score, question by question. And then you can see the weightings as well. So you can take into account different categories are weighted higher, like targets is the highest. And so setting targets is going to give you more of a boost in your score, whereas scope 1 and 2 emissions are 13%. So you can go down here and look at the different weightings. And we go through all this into extreme detail in this 4-hour workshop for CDP, just like we do for EcoVadis. And we come up with a really clear plan. So just to give you a sense of what it looks like, this is September 9th is our next quarterly workshop. You can see in the new platform, I actually gave you a screenshot of the newest. CDP is getting cleaner and nicer and easier to look at, but they'll break these down into the categories. So these are the categories I just showed with the scores and the weightings, but you can drill in and just say, I want to look at this category. And we will walk you through and say, based on your existing scores, your category scores, where you are against your peers, and the weighting of those, where should you prioritize? And then we do these quick wins, short, medium, and long term, and basically create a 5-year master plan that you can take question by question, how to improve your score, not just in the short term, but to consistently improve. And one of the things to remember is that if you're only looking at the letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, that's going to improve no matter what. But if your goal is to improve against your peers, then you really need to keep moving, because your peers are going to keep improving because they can see if they're a laggard, they're going to try to get better. So standing still is a way to fall behind within your industry group. So having this 5-year plan is something that we really recommend. And then I would ask you, what resources would help you, or maybe even say your suppliers, take the next steps. Nothing We're Good, CDP Climate Training, CDP Climate Planning Services, greenhouse gas training, sustainability, ESG training, or something else. I'll tell you from an SGS standpoint, we're working on, we have really strong targets, but they're only, I think, currently covering scope 1 and 2 science-based targets. So we need to, and we're actively working on setting science-based targets that do include scope 3. And I believe that is our major point that's keeping us from the A list. And there's one other one that now I'm blanking on. I just talked with Beatrice Lopez, who's the leader of our global team. I think just sourcing renewable energy, especially here, like in the US. So we have some very clear things. There are only a few that we can look at. So I would say like CDP Climate Planning Services possibly, or other for us. But I'll give it a few moments. And if you have any more, give it just a second. So we got CDP Climate Training, greenhouse gas training, sustainability, ESG training. So training is really big, especially with a lot of the regulatory schemes we've shown are actually proposed. And even if they've been in effect, they might go into effect in a year or in 2 years, depending on the size of your company. And so that is something that we see a lot. I'll say that we have the ability to help you. This is kind of your whole client journey, is that we span across the whole journey, where we focus big on training and assurance, but my team does greenhouse gas training, specifically have a CDP Climate workshop. We also do ESG training and an EcoVadis workshop. We have greenhouse gas accounting and a CDP ratings boost, just like we similarly have ESG materiality assessment, like that is aligned with CSRD coming out of Europe, and an EcoVadis rating boost service. But we do something called a gap analysis or pre-assurance. They're both basically a pre-assurance for greenhouse gas or your full sustainability report. Those are just spot checks. And then you have limited and reasonable verification. Sometimes it's just of your greenhouse gas emissions, but more and more folks are also doing they're adding in other environmental and social KPIs in a sustainability report. And we provide all of those. And so why is that important? I think the most overlooked one is that internal confidence, even if it's not regulatory mandated, that internal confidence in your own investments and strategies that you're making as a company. You want to believe and trust your numbers. And so sometimes this spot check or this pre-assurance is a really good, cost-effective, shorter, 100% remote available service. But then you also have meeting regulatory requirements, which typically have to be to a standard, improving your ESG ratings and scores, and providing external confidence to customers and stakeholders. That's your traditional, typical driver. Like I said, we have a CDP Climate workshop. We have greenhouse gas. This is how we break down our greenhouse gas training. And we have our auditors and our lead auditors who are actually our trainers. So we have some of the best trainers in the world, I would argue. And September 23rd through the 27th is our next series. We do them quarterly. We do private trainings as well, but we break it down into like an intro course, but then you have standard by standard ISO 14064-1, which is organizational footprints. Then we have a project footprints for carbon offset projects. Then we have a product carbon footprint for individual products in ISO 14067. And then we actually have a verification and validation course for internal and external auditors if you want to learn about the auditing process and how to prepare and even conduct audits. So like I said, we've got quite a bit. The EcoVadis workshop is very similar to CDP, but in the broader ESG training space, we do focus our training, like I said, on roles. So we have a strategy for leadership, and that's if you're in the governance body, that's for you. Execution, we really talk about day-to-day operations. If you own a material topic like energy, water, waste, safety, things like that. And then reporting, if you're doing communications in any way on how to report these KPIs. We have a massively growing YouTube channel. We have 100+ videos with 100+ hours of free on-demand content. This webinar will be on there soon, but if you want to go play around, I highly suggest it. And you'll get a lot of value out of that. It's just SGS North America is our handle. And left plenty of time for questions. So Kim is our dedicated business development manager, and she's wonderful to connect with. I can also, I'm a little more nerdy and technical, so I can help if it's super technical, but we have a great team, and I just invite anybody to reach out for yourself or any of your suppliers that need help with CDP or something else. But with that, I'll just say, I'll open it up for Q&A and let me know what questions you have. Sorry, let me grab a drink of water. So a popular one is the SEC ruling. So the SEC ruling is, like many of these, it's an election year. So that one is it is delayed. There's a challenge in the court, and we'll see what happens in the US. It's an election year, so it's the US SEC. The California rule does have a legal challenge as well. I think that one's expected to be resolved much quicker. And then the CARB, the California Air Resources Board, is expected to come out with more clarifications on the actual details, because there's going to be a fee. There's going to be some definitions of what doing business in California means. But I would just say that if you're waiting, I wouldn't hold your breath too much. There's going to be more, and there are industry specific. we're going to keep seeing, not only the US and Canada, but globally, the trend is not slowing down. The rate at which it's speeding up is changing, and some people are calling that ESG backlash. But the truth is, it's growing, and the rate at which it was growing was incredible. And there's been some sort of checks and balances. The growth rate is slowing down, and that's what ESG kind of backlash is being called. But it is not reversing. It is not becoming less. It's just continuing to grow at a slightly slower pace. But with IFRS and ISSB, S1 and S2, and all of the jurisdictions that fall under all around the world currently interpreting those, it will open, the floodgates are probably going to open back up in the not too distant future, like the end of this year and next year. I strongly suggest at least getting trained and understand what it does require, because sometimes it doesn't require as much as you think, especially some of these that are just an S1 and S2, or sorry, a Scope 1 and Scope 2, not to confuse with the standards. So that's my feedback on these proposed rules. And yes, the rate will be impacted by an election year, I think both in Canada and the US, but I think that will be a speed of growth, not a growth versus shrinkage. That's never seemed to be the case, and I don't think anybody expects it to be that way in the future. So great questions. Anything else, Q&A on CDP? I can't imagine I gave a perfect presentation, but hopefully the scoring methodology was clear. I'll just say if there are no questions, then I can hand over to Kim. But I just want to thank everybody for your time today. I know it's busy. Come back and see the recording, share it with people on YouTube, link once it's up in about a week. And yeah, Kim, anything I forgot today?
No, I think that covers the agenda today, but please don't hesitate to reach out directly if we can be of any help. Thank you, Adam, for all the wonderful information, and thanks everybody for your time. Have a great day.